Hi, I'm Virginia Grounds, and you're listening to the Caretakers Journey podcast.
Welcome, my friends, to another meaningful conversation. I'm your host, Carole Leathem, and my guest today is my friend, Virginia Grounds. Now, you might remember her because she was on an episode, I think in 2025 or 2024 it was, and I have asked her to come back because she has written a new book. Virginia is an author, a speaker, she's a publisher, a podcaster. She has years experience teaching Bible studies in her home and speaking at women's events. She loves to serve women. And in addition, she worked with her husband for 20 years in full-time Christian ministry. Those experiences of helping others through their difficulty, as well as going through her own, have led her to a deeper trust, a deeper faith, and a deeper understanding of how God equips each one of us, not just for walking through adversity, but how can we use that? And how can we find meaning from that adversity? Virginia has written a beautiful new book called Wings, Hope for Widows. And she wrote this book in association with some other widows. And so I've had the privilege of looking through it already. And I'm telling you, if you know a widow, and I know several, get them a copy because it is amazing. This book is filled with biblical study and practical information. Virginia, I'm so excited to welcome you to our show.
Carole, I'm excited to be here. You mentioned that I'd been on before, and my mind just went back to that time because it was a time where I was still struggling with some things. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Oh, and Virginia, your episode back then, we shared tips and tools for caregivers, and it is still one of the most listened to episodes. And I'm going to put the link to that show as well as this one in the show notes for this one. So, Virginia, I want to talk to you as we start out about something that I had never heard of. I love when I learn something new, and I love when that new thing affects people I love and helps me understand what they're going through. And you write about widow brain. Share with us what that is and how this relates to the grief of losing your husband.
I'll be happy to. It's something that I'd never heard of before, and I discovered it as I was writing this book. And I wish that I had known about it in my early stages of grief after I lost my husband. And what it is, it's just so great to have a name put to it because we do experience it. But what it is it's that fogginess of our brain that where we just can't make a decision. We don't have clear thoughts. Everything is just kind of a blur. That is the widow brain. Those are symptoms of the widow brain, and it comes as a result of grief. And of course, these same symptoms would apply whether it's to a widow or someone who has lost a loved one very close to them that they've been responsible for. And so as the listeners, if they order the book, and I would encourage them to do so, they'll be able to read about widow brain in the very beginning of the book. So they have that understanding as they begin to move through the stories and the tips and the Bible study that's there. I want to read one little thing here that it says because it applies to us. It says, we may think that we're abnormal because the symptoms can last from months to 1 year or longer. The more we the more we deny grief, the longer the widow brain will last.
Wow.
And I know that so often there are many of us that have so much on our plate that we don't necessarily deny the grief, we shove it back because we have other things that we need to take care of, other people that we need to take care of. And what I've learned is that's delayed grief, and it's not healthy. We need to go ahead and address all of those symptoms at the time that we're experiencing them so that we can begin to heal.
Oh my gosh,
And
so good.
yeah. I know. I'm famous for that delayed grief. I can tell you.
Well, I know I just lost my mom March 31st of
Yes,
this
I'm
year.
sorry.
And I ended up going to Milwaukee one last time. I wasn't there when she passed away, which was very hard for me after everything I had been through these last 3 years. And when I got there, everything it had been about 5 days, and the grief kicked in the minute I walked into her apartment, which
Mhm,
was
mhm,
half empty, everything in disarray. My family had already started packing, and it hit me so hard.
mhm,
And when I left Milwaukee 10 days later to fly home, I just sobbed on the airplane. And
mhm.
then I've noticed in the month of April and the rest of April and most of May, that fogginess that you talk about, where I'm like, I have so many things to do. I have so many decisions to make because I am the executor. I'm the one that's got to plan the service and figure out
Yeah.
what we're going to do. And it,
Mhm.
it is true that grief creates this fog. And I really resonated with some of the symptoms you talked about
Yeah.
in your book when it comes to widows, because grief does affect us. And there's still mornings when I pick up my phone and think, oh, I haven't talked to Tammy, who was the head nurse. I haven't talked to Tammy. I need to call Tammy. No, I don't.
Yes.
Or I can't delete her my mom's
Mhm.
text messages are still in my phone. Can't delete them. So, yeah, I think that's so cool. And I think that it helps to understand and gives us the permission to be kind to ourselves when we're struggling. So, you also share 3 lessons that we
Mhm.
can learn from grief. And these are really good lessons. And these apply to widows, or for those of us who are caregivers, or for those of us who have lost, like you said, someone close to us that we've been caring for. And the first lesson you talk about is God is faithful. So break
Yes.
that down for us and talk about what you mean when you say God is faithful.
Yes. I put this in terms of the things God has taught me through my caregiving and through my grief.
Mhm.
And as I prayed about it, the Lord he just revealed it in such a magnificent way. He is faithful. That's the number one thing. Now, what's interesting about that word faithful in the Bible is as I researched it, I discovered that there are so many more references to faithful as it relates to believers.
Mhm.
And there are only a few as it relates to God. But what we have is a command from God's word that we're to be faithful to Him. And yet, in other verses, we have the assurance that God is faithful to us. And I'll just read you a couple of verses about that. And the first one is in First Corinthians chapter 1, verse 5. And it says this: God is faithful, by whom you were called into fellowship of His Son, Jesus Christ. God is faithful, by whom you were called. And I want you to keep that in mind, because as I go into that third point, this is going to come into play. And then in 1 Corinthians 10:13, it says, God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. 1 Corinthians 10:13. And I'll just give you an example. God has been faithful in so many ways, but I'll give you one example. As I was sitting in my Bible study time, and I was praying through these things that the Lord had given me, it took me back to Second Timothy, the book of Second Timothy. And as I turned the last page, I saw a, a note that I had written to myself and dated it in October of 2016. And the note said this. Well, let me back up a minute. That last page in Second Timothy in my Bible was blank. And I read these verses, all of these verses about the faithfulness of God. And so I wrote this note that said, God's promise to fill the blank page. And that had to do with our move um, to another state from a place we had lived for 40 years. And I was grieving the loss
Mhm.
of friendships, the loss of church, the loss of everything that I was familiar with. But I wrote down that day God's promise to fill the blank page. And you know what? I am so happy now that on this day last week, I was able to date it and write 3 words. And he did.
Mm.
And
Wow.
he did.
Wow.
He enabled me through all of the hardship, through all of the grief that I went through and the loss of my husband. He gave me 4 books to write. He gave me a job with a publishing company and now my own. He's given me these podcast opportunities to share what he has taught me through grief and hardship.
Mm. And Virginia, I think that's so important because I'm sure there's some listeners that are sitting out there right now that are going, I don't feel like God is faithful. And I don't know if I can say that I believe that God is faithful. And I know when you walk through hard times, and I know for me, the last 10 years have been that point where I have to say, I believe God is faithful. I believe God is faithful. And sometimes we have to say that before we actually see it. And I love that you share how God has been faithful because I know for me, it's the practical everyday things. Like we were just talking before we hit record about how God had worked it out for the sale of your house
Mm-hmm.
in a crazy way so that you could then move back to a place that you knew, where you had friends, where you had a church, where you had been established. So it's like God took you away in that blank page, but then he brings you back. And I loved that part of the story because sometimes when things don't work out the way we think, we get frustrated, we get scared, we get angry, we get all of these emotions, especially if we're walking through grief. And then we turn around and we see later on that this was all part of the process and is part of God's faithfulness is that he walks through all of this. Cannot tell you. I was talking about getting on the plane to leave Milwaukee and the grief that I felt.
Yes.
And I prayed that whoever was sitting in the center seat would just leave me alone because I knew I was going to be a mess. I'd
Mm-hmm.
stuffed my sweatshirt with Kleenex. And all of a sudden I feel this hand on my shoulder and this woman says to me, "Honey, are you afraid to fly?" and I looked at her and my tear, I mean, I was a mess. And I said, "No, my mom just passed away and I'm leaving Milwaukee for the last time." And the clouds parted and I see the city. I mean, I was just a mess. And it turned out that she was the care pastor of a church in Milwaukee.
Oh,
And for 3 hours, she just like jumped into her profession and just ministered to me. And that's how God is faithful. Sometimes he
that's right.
uses other people. And
He
right
puts
now,
people in our path
yeah,
in the most unexpected ways and times.
yes, yes.
Oh,
And
that's
and I
awesome.
have stayed in touch with her.
Oh, that's
she's actually texted me. She's actually said, "How you doing?" It's just so interesting when we see how
great.
faithful he is. And a lot of times we have to take our eyes off of the circumstances. We have to kind of step away from our grief for a moment and take a wider view of what's going on in order to see that. So I would challenge you, if your first response when listening to us talk is God is not faithful, to step back and look. And if you feel like it, just say, "Please show me. Please show
Mm-hmm.
me how faithful
That's
you
right.
are." So the second lesson, and I love this because The number one thing that I, as a caregiver, struggle with, and I know that this is not unique to me, although although sometimes it feels like it, is we feel isolated. We
Mm.
feel alone. And you talk about the second lesson is that God will never leave you alone. And I have learned this, but share with us why this was so important for you and what you meant but when you wrote this.
Okay, I would love to. Um, wow. I think any widow who would be listening to this would relate to the fact that really, for me, the number one issue of being a widow is being lonely.
Mm,
And that was especially true as I was living so far away from my family, from my children, my grandchildren, even my great grandchildren. And I missed them
mm,
desperately. And the loneliness was really hard to get through. And when it hits is at night, because
mm,
typically for most of us that would be the time, and the day's coming to an end, we sit down with our husbands, we have dinner together, we watch TV together, we would talk together. And so when you, as a widow, sit down at night, you're eating alone,
mm,
and you don't even want to watch TV, and you have no one to snuggle up with to watch it with. And it's hard. It's really,
mhm,
really hard. But this is one of the promises from God, from His Word, that He will never leave us or forsake us.
mm,
And the scriptures that I will read that have to do with that, first of all, is Deuteronomy 31:6. It says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them." Now, that them for us today, that's the enemy of our soul.
mhm,
That's the spiritual warfare that we fight when we are weak. And when we're going through grief, we are weak. We've been weakened by the loss and by the emotions that come as a result of the loss. So we do have that enemy to fight. But God says, "Be strong and courageous, do not fear or be in dread of that. For it is the Lord who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you."
mm,
And then in Hebrews 13:5, I thought this was very interesting. Uh, it's talking about things, but we can relate it to people. And it says, "Be content with what you have.
mm,
For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you." Now, this contentment, be content with what you have, is about provision. And we have both the assurance that God's not going to leave us, but we also have instruction for living. And that is to be strong and courageous.
mhm,
Don't have any fear as we walk through this journey, because God is faithful to provide. I
mhm,
have seen it time after time after time in my own life of how He has done that. But this is something interesting I learned. That word content, when you translate it into the Bible's language, it means to be strong enough to ward off the enemy's attempts to tell us that we need something we don't have, whether it's a person
mm,
or a thing. God provides us with what we need. And He's proved that over the years of my spiritual journey. He's proved that just this recently in me being able to move and being able to qualify and afford a home on my own. Only God could do that. Only
mhm.
God.
I love that.
And therefore, in those times of loneliness, if we would just, in our hearts and minds, just say, "Lord, I know you're with me, but I'm lonely tonight.
Mhm,
And I pray that you will fill that loneliness within me with your word, with a person,
mm,
with something that's going to give me the confidence of knowing that you will never leave me and
mm.
I'm never alone."
I love that so much. As a caretaker, I'm sure there's caretakers who are going to resonate so clearly with what I'm about to say. And we did touch on this in our original interview. When you go through a traumatic event, like I have with my husband's mental health or with your husband who struggled with cancer, my husband is still alive, and we're still navigating the drama and the problems of what this looks like in our lives, but it changes your relationship. And so you can actually feel lonely as a caregiver.
Mhm.
Well, especially if you're caring for a spouse, because your relationship has changed. I often express that I feel like an earthquake came through my life and changed just totally changed the landscape
Mhm.
of my life. An earthquake. I'm in California, where we do earthquakes, and when an earthquake comes, a lot of times we don't see it, but it actually shifts. It actually changes the
Mhm.
earth. It changes the ground. And that's kind of how it feels like. And so there are times where I'm sitting there in the evening and I'm feeling alone, and I'm
Mhm.
feeling that, God, where are you? How is this going to work out? Feeling. And the same thing that you just said, we have to go back to the promise. We have to go back and see where he's been faithful. And then we have to remember the promise of the Holy Spirit,
Mhm.
which is inside of us when we come to Jesus. And so a lot of times I'll just take my hand and put my hand on my chest and go, okay, I know you're there. I know you're there. I know I'm not
Mhm.
alone. And then a lot of times, he sends people. Again, he'll send someone. He'll send a text message. He'll send an email. He'll send a card in the mail. He'll send a phone call. And, God he never, never, never leaves us alone. The third lesson, and I love this because this is playing out in both of our lives. I think a lot of times when you get to a certain age,
Mhm.
this will air after, but I'm about to have a big birthday tomorrow. And when you get to this age of like late 60s, which is where I'm sitting right now, you think, am I done? Should I retire? Should I just stop?
Mhm.
Is there anything really left for me to do? And then I remember, oh, wait, I committed to a podcast. Oh, wait, I committed to a ministry. And
Mhm.
I love that God has opened these doors,
Mhm.
because so many times we think, oh, we just need to, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And God takes and challenges us. And so one of the things that I love about you, Virginia, is you're in the same kind of situation as me, where God is opening up all these doors of things for you. So the third lesson is God's not finished with us. And I like
And
to
you left
say, go ahead.
and you left out the part about me being old.
Well, yeah, I think we're both of a certain age. Um, but I love this idea that God is not finished with us, especially when we get to this point in my life and in our lives as older women, that there's still things that we can do. And one of the things I like to say to myself in the morning is, "Oop, I woke up, I'm breathing. God's got something for me to do today." And I just get out of bed and I just start going. And I think that there might be some listeners who are kind of wondering, is God finished with me? So
Mhm.
share with us how God is not finished with you in this stage of your life as a widow, as a woman of a certain age.
I'll do that, Carol. But first, I want to back up just a little bit because I did want to address something you said, talking about the fact that we're lonely.
Mm,
And what I wanted to say is that for caregivers and widows, what we're doing is we're grieving something that once was that will never be again.
yes.
And I wanted to read you something that about that widow brain. It says that hold on a minute. Oh yes, here it is. It is believed that the widow brain acts as a coping mechanism to shield
Mm,
itself from excruciating pain and grief. And what
wow.
I wanted to say about that is that one of the things that will enable us to work through this grief um, and get further along in it. I'm not sure we ever get out of it,
Mm,
but to get further along in it is that it can strike us at unexpected moments like a tsunami.
mm,
This wave of grief just comes on us like a tsunami, and the tears begin to pour out, just like they did for you on that flight.
Mm-hmm.
And my encouragement to anybody that's listening is, or going through grief, is to give into it in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't make any difference where you are or who's around you or what you're doing. If that tsunami comes upon you, you can't control it.
Mm-mm.
You can't stop it. The tears are going to come, and they're not going to stop until they're finished. But I will tell you this, when the tears do stop in that session of the tsunami wave, when they finally do stop, you're going to feel refreshed.
Yeah.
Your brain is going to be a little more clear. This is God's healing mechanism for us. Those tears He puts in a bottle, He remembers every
Mm-hmm.
tear, and He uses those to
Mm-hmm.
begin that healing process
So
in us.
beautiful.
And so I wanted to touch back on some things that you had said.
That's
But
beautiful.
yes, God
That is
is never.
so beautiful. Thank just for 1 second. I just thank you for doing that because I think sometimes we feel weak. I know
Mhm.
I do. When I just lose it. I lost it at the gym a couple weeks ago. I was working out and my trainer came by and he said the right he said something to me and he knew what I was going through and I looked at him and I said, "Don't be nice to me." Don't be nice to me. And I think he was a little shocked. And I just kind of burst into tears and I had to walk out into the parking lot. And it's funny because I just went out in the parking lot and I just lost it. And then he came out. He actually left the training and came out into the parking lot to make sure I was okay. But I think there's things that we don't always know what's going to trigger it. And yeah, it's important to give into it because once it happened, that moment, and I did feel the release of the
Yes.
energy. And I think we need to
Yes.
understand that that is God's gift of taking the pressure out of our system. So thank you for going back and talking about that because it's so important. So the third lesson is God is not
Yes.
finished with us. So, Virginia, tell us what God is doing in your life and how we can see that God is not finished with us when we get to this point.
Well, I won't tell you my age, but I will tell you that I'm older than you, Carol. And I think God has proven through these last years, as I've gone through caregiving and grief, that He's not finished with me.
Mhm.
And He gave me, He gave me opportunities that I didn't know at the time were in preparation for what would take place now.
Mhm.
And God never wastes anything.
Mm-mm.
Everything that we've gone through, every career opportunity we've had, every ministry opportunity we've ever had is never wasted.
Mm.
God will use the lessons and the experiences that we've had in the past to mature us in the faith, to draw us closer to Him,
Yeah.
and to use us according to His purpose. In Romans 8:28, it tells us that all things work together for good to those who are called by God according to His purpose, those who love God and are called according to His purpose. Well, those who love God are believers,
Mhm.
and every believer is called according to God's purpose.
Yeah.
And that purpose never ends as long as we have breath in our bodies. You mentioned waking up in the morning
Yeah.
going, "Oh, well, I'm still breathing." Well, that means that God has a purpose for you in that day. And
Mhm.
I know that in the process of grief and caregiving, that there are those days we wake up and we just want to curl up in a ball and stay in bed.
Mhm.
But even in those days, God has a purpose for us. We may not see it at the time, we may not know it at the time, and we certainly don't know what the future holds. But my encouragement in those days is to understand that it's okay to take one step at a time, one breath at a time, one moment of a
Mhm.
time. But I would also encourage you in those times to seek the Lord's wisdom and ask Him, "Lord, what is your purpose for me today?
Mm.
What are you putting in front of me today? Who are you putting in front
Yes.
of me today that you want to use me for some purpose in their lives?
Mm.
And I promise you that he will do that. And not only will he do it, but you will be uplifted
Mm.
because your focus then will not be on yourself. Your focus will not be on your circumstances and how hard life is, because life is hard for all of us,
Yes.
even more so in this day and age. But God will give you something in that day that is going to lift you up. I saw something on Facebook. Well, this week and last week, I've seen it several times, and it says this: You're not broken, you're grieving.
Oh, I love that. I've seen that same thing.
Yes. And when we begin to understand that we are not broken, that we're grieving, and that grief is something God gives us to be able to process what we've been through, and he gives it to us for our healing.
Mhm.
And as we begin to heal, we begin to seek and see or have a vision of what the future holds for us according to his purpose. God
Yeah.
is never finished with us. And we need to keep that in mind. I love 2 Timothy 1:9, and this is that verse that took me to the blank page, or helped me to find that blank page. But it says, talking about Jesus, who has saved us and called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, not according to this caregiving, not according to what we've done in our grief, but according to God's own purpose and grace, which he has given to us in Christ Jesus. And get this, before time began.
That's a
God's had a
beautiful thought.
purpose for us since the beginning of time. And when we begin to understand that, it's so awe-inspiring that how can we not
Mm.
acknowledge it and ask the
Yes.
Lord, God, I am weary. I'm tired. I feel weak today. I don't want to face the day. I don't
Mhm.
want to have to face these responsibilities. But I know you have a purpose for me even in this one day.
Mm.
And I pray that you will show me what it is. And he will
Oh,
do it. He's
I
never
love that.
finished. He is
I
never
love that.
finished. We don't have an excuse because he's had a purpose for us from the beginning of time.
That's such a
Age
beautiful
age
truth.
is no barrier. It
Age
is
is no
no
barrier.
factor.
I
It
love
is no
that.
factor.
What a
Yes.
beautiful thought that he had a purpose for us from the beginning of time. And I think taking that one step further, when we are willing to lean into the circumstances and the pain and the things that we're learning through our journey,
Mhm.
he, I don't know about you, but he puts people in my path who need what I've learned. That's why you write. That's why I write. That's why we do what we do, because God has called us to a ministry of reaching out to other people. And when my husband crashed and we were no longer in the ministry and I was no longer doing all of the things that I had been done before, I actually thought, oh, he's done with me. And then 2 years ago, God's like, no, I'm not done with you yet. Here's a book, here's a podcast, here's the speaking, and he's opening the doors. So what are some things that God has opened up for you now, Virginia? Tell us about your publishing company that you've started and this new ministry that you have.
I will. And Carol, when I was still in the other state, when God had not moved me here yet, I got a phone call one day from my husband's hospice nurse.
I love
And
that.
she wanted to know, she knew us so well. She knew our spiritual journey, she knew our spiritual history. And she wanted to know if I would be interested in coming to work for them as a hospice chaplain. And without even thinking about it, I said yes, which is so unlike me. And so for the 6 months that I remained there last year, I served as a hospice chaplain. And I have to tell you, that was God's purpose for me in the remainder of my
Mm,
time there, because it was so fulfilling.
mm,
I never dreamed that it would do more for me than it did for these precious people that I had the privilege of meeting. And that's one thing that God did to reveal a purpose to me in that interim time while I waited for Him to make this move. But this move has been interesting. It's been a God thing, totally and completely, because, well, it just happened so fast for one thing. And for another thing, when I came to look at this house, this agent didn't know me from Adam. And I was asking about the neighbors, and you're not going to believe what he said to me. He said, well, who knows but what this could be your new mission field. And I mean, my mouth fell open. I was like, wow, God has a purpose for me being in this particular house, in this particular neighborhood. And so I'm excited to see what he's going to do here. But yes, after my husband's death, the Lord put 3 books in me and published 3 books. This last one, as Carole said, is Wings. And my purpose for that book was to help widows who've been widows for a while and are ready to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've seen so many women, widows, who get stuck.
Mm.
They get stuck there in their grief and they don't move forward. And that's not God's intention. God never intends for us to get stuck in grief. He intends for us to heal from it, address it, have those tsunami moments for healing,
Mm-hmm.
and then to be able to move forward out of that widow's brain, out of that fogginess. But I have to tell you, it takes time.
Mm-hmm.
I had this widow's brain for, I don't want to tell you, but I had it for a little over 2 years, and it's been a little over 2 years since my husband passed away. So I can honestly say that for the first time in a very long time, I feel better than I have felt in years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happier. My brain is more clear. I'm able to move forward with decisions and with ministry. And the Lord put on my heart that name Wings as the acrostic for Widows and New Growth Seasons.
Oh, I love
And
that.
out of that came a ministry website that is called hopeforwidows.com. Now, that 4 is the number, not FOR, it's the number 4, hope, number 4, widows.com. My plan, and it's not, it hasn't happened yet. My plan is to have some online support systems to, to start widow support groups, because we started one in this area where I was in Oklahoma, and they were so helpful to each one of us. We became fast friends and were able to support one another. We would get together and play games and just do some fun things, as well as be able to talk through things that we knew the others there would understand what we were saying. I have discovered that there are those who've never experienced widowhood or this kind of grief that really don't want to hear about it. And you want to talk about your husband, and you should. But there are those who change the subject because it's uncomfortable for them. But when you have a widows group, you're with a bunch of women that will listen, and they understand. They know exactly what you're going through. So that's the ministry the Lord has given me out of this, and I believe that's my purpose for this point in time in my life, as well as helping women who have a story to tell be able to get their story published. And that's the publishing company that I have, breakthroughchristianpublishing.com. And my mission, my purpose is to help women who can't get a traditional publisher. That's a very difficult thing to do these days. And they want to, their story's important. It needs to be read by other women going through the same thing. And so I want to help them do that in a way that's affordable, in a way that is less stressful for them and more helpful. And that's at breakthroughchristianpublishing.com.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'll put all of that in the show notes so that people can click and go right there. I'll put the link to your book in the show notes so they can just click on it and go purchase it. And I'm going to encourage you. If I'm sitting here while you were talking, and I literally have 5 women now that I need to go back and buy this book for. So,
Oh,
so your sales are gonna jump this week, because I'm gonna have to.
Yay!
I ordered my copy. Now I need to go order for 5 more that I've just thought of that have come across my. I mean, I've got one who's freshly. Her husband just passed away a little over 2 weeks ago, and I ran into her in the store. And while we were talking, I was just like, oh my gosh, I can see exactly what you were talking about. So thank you for joining me today with this message of hope for widows and caretakers. Is there one thought that you would like to leave with us? And I know you
Yes,
do, so tell us.
I do. I want to tell you that this book is an anthology. It's been written by other women who are widows. They have shared their stories. But what I wanted in this book is encouragement for women in this situation to be able to have hope that there is a future for them, that God has not given up on them yet. And so what I've done, because the thing that kept me sane through especially that first year was keeping my focus on Jesus, staying in God's word. And I wanted this book to accomplish the same thing for anybody that reads it. And so after every chapter, which is a story from one of the widows, after every chapter, I've given Bible study questions from John chapters 13 through 16, 17. The reason I did and the reason I chose those particular passages is because I discovered that Jesus was not only preparing his disciples for his departure, he was preparing his disciples for how to live after his departures.
I love it.
Well, ladies, I just want to tell you, we are his disciples if we're believers in Christ. And he has given us in his word how we're to live after not only his departure, but the departure of our loved one who is gone now to be in heaven.
I love that so much. And I will put, again, all of that in the show notes so that they can click. And it sounds like your book would be the perfect book to use for starting a widows group where you could go through it together and do the Bible study together. And I may put a personal note in at least 2 of the books I'm going to send out and suggest that to them. So
Great.
Thank you for joining me today. I am so blessed and honored to call you friends. And, it's just one of these days, hopefully we'll get to be in the same room and get a big, nice Virginia hug from you. And I am so thankful for all of you who have tuned in and listened to our conversation today. And if you know a caretaker or if you know a widow, share the show with them, because I just know that every widow out there is going to be touched, not just by our conversation, Virginia, but by your book. It was very, and I am honored to know some of the women who collaborated with you on this book. If you would like to follow or subscribe to the podcast, that helps other caretakers find us. And also make sure you go to the website and join the mailing list, because as of June 1st, I've started a new weekly newsletter that goes out every week. It's full of inspiration, tips, giveaways, free stuff, and information about fun events that are coming in 2025 and 2026. And if Virginia starts opening up these widows groups, I'm sure we will put some information about that in one of the newsletters. The email community is always going to be the ones who get the information first. So you want to be on that information. You want to be on the mailing list. And I hope that you will join me next week for another meaningful conversation about what it looks like to be on the Caretaker's Journey. And until then, it's all